Welcome back to another episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have a special episode for you guys. I have a returning guest who came back with her husband today. You guys, if you want to look for her initial episode, look under Laurel O'Sullivan. She's a grief educator, guide, and former public interest lawyer who helps people transform loss into deeper belonging with themselves, with others, and with life. She experienced loss on a very deep level of losing her father, the father of her children, and the most devastating loss, her 18-year-old son Patrick, who died by suicide. The reason I'm having her back on the show today is that she was able to invite her husband, Tim McCauley, to join us today. And the reason for this is that I do talk to a lot of people that go through grief, but it's primarily women. And I wanted to get a husband perspective and a male perspective on what this grief journey looks like. And so I want you guys to give a nice warm welcome to Tim McCauley, Laurel's husband, and welcome Laurel back to the show. And I want to welcome you guys onto the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. And I remember it's a very powerful story that you told me about losing Patrick on the first episode. And that's why I'll encourage everybody listening, go back and listen to the first episode with Laurel. It's a very powerful story about loss and healing, that's very, very moving. What I wanted to start out today, though, for those of you guys who didn't listen to that episode, Laurel and Pat and Tim, I'm going to have you guys share that story again with us, just to catch up our listeners.
Sure. I'll say it from kind of my perspective because it's obviously very similar, but it just has a different viewpoint on it, and people can listen to the other to get Laurel's view. From my perspective, yeah, um, yeah, we had kind of going up, leading up to that point, we were in Patrick had just graduated high school. Things seemed to be going very well, both for him and for everyone else. Laurel and I had been struggling for quite a while with a sickness she was going through. And so we were actually up in Rochester, Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic, um, getting a diagnosis after having been to, multiple experts in the Chicagoland area. And then, we've got a diagnosis in Rochester. Yeah, the path up to that point, Patrick was going to be going to Northwestern University. He was an incredibly smart kid. And yeah, he was the youngest of our five kids, combined kids. So I was his stepfather. And at home, when we went to Rochester, his brother and one of his stepbrothers was at home with them. All of them, I forget how, 18, 20, 19, so in those ages at the time. And so here we are coming back from Rochester in the morning, um, kind of on well, we got news, that's good. Laurel's going to be having, a pretty serious spinal cord surgery. But at least someone was able to tell us, hey, here's exactly what's going to be going next. I'm worried, is she going to be able to walk again and things of that nature? Just to finish that line, she's fine now and all of this. So they did an amazing job. But at that point in time, we didn't know what was going to be going on. And so it was a very stressful time. And, then, and I'm sure it was stressful for everyone. We didn't probably, speaking for myself, I didn't recognize, if others were feeling the same strain that we were seeing or that I was feeling. And so, the way I've kind of been raised, my responsibility is, hey, be the rock, how you just, get through these things. Emotions are for later. Now is for what do you need to do? What's the next step needed this minute? and go through things that way. And so we're driving back from Rochester in the morning. I forget if it was a Tuesday, I think,
Yeah.
maybe 9 in the morning or so. And Laurel gets a phone call. I'm driving, nice highway in Minnesota. And I can kind of hear parts of what she's saying. And all of a sudden, she starts screaming. And I'm hearing the words she's saying and what the person that's saying it to her is saying, and I instantly know what's happened. Um, it's one that had no idea that uh, he had ever contemplated, Patrick had ever contemplated, killing himself. Laurel initially seemed to be kind of in a bit of a denial on what was going on because I heard the facts that she said, and I kind of had my ignore all the emotions and just deal with the facts at that point. And the facts were my wife was um, beside herself is too tame a term. Um, Someone else at that point. I'm already driving at maybe 75, 80 miles an hour going down the road, trying to figure out, okay, well, we're 4 hours drive from home. There's nothing we can do for the next 4 hours. Yeah, at that point, it's also what can we do for the our two kids that were already home,
So if I can just
please.
like interrupt for a second, I actually don't know that Chris knows this story because I don't
Oh,
think I've talked to him about it. In part because as I've realized lately, it's hard for me. It's not the telling of the story, but the physical ailment that I had, which was a benign tumor in my spinal cord, just went out the door when I think about the other trauma. So it was like layers of trauma, right? I had a medical trauma, and then we get this obviously tragic, traumatic news while we're driving home. So when he says I became somebody else, I quite literally became somebody else. Like I quite literally, I look back and obviously I was in shock, you know, but I also at that moment, like it is the worst. I will never ever feel as powerless as I felt in that moment because we are, as Tim said, 3.5 hours away from home. Just got this devastating news. It was unclear to me because not only was I receiving a phone call from our uh, cleaning lady who was there with the boys, who was the one who called me, and then she told me to call 911. Well, you cannot call 911 when you're in another state. So here I am trying to Google the phone number of our local police department to call them, and they're telling me, oh, the paramedics are already there. We'll patch you through. And so there was this like what felt like an eternity of time of trying to decipher what was happening. I just knew my son was injured severely. And so I mean, it took about 10 minutes of then getting patched through to the paramedic who then asked me information about my son. And in my mind, I'm sitting here going, okay, this is really bad. Maybe we're not going to college. Maybe something's going to delay, and it's like you're kind of trying to brace yourself, right? And so then I simply became a bit of like, I would call it like a caged animal in that car because, as Tim said, knowing that our two boys were home alone and how can, you know, I can't, there is no good story around this topic, of course, but this one pretty much had a lot of really intense aspects to it.
yeah, and then I'm sorry, from my perspective as well, then Laurel said caged animal, which I think was a good analogy because I was inside that cage, driving the car, trying to get us home, and just taking the brunt of things, and trying to process things, and unsuccessfully at that point. So that's kind of that part of the story. So there's
I just I just can't imagine, you know, you were going on a trip for a medical purpose and for a very serious one, by the way, a spinal surgery. And that's got inherent risk across the board with it, not just to remove a tumor, but let alone that might, you know, disable or dysfunction your ability to walk and certain functions of life. And that may change things in a lot of ways just with that by itself. But then to find out that news that Patrick had committed suicide right after that. And the one thing that you know, I'm glad you brought up, and it's something I have a hard time talking about it myself because I've experienced it, but it's that feeling of hopelessness. It's that feeling of there's nothing I can do to fix this. There's nothing I can say or do that's going to change this moment or bring them back. And your mind almost is going 1,000 miles an hour. And Laurel, I totally get where you said I was a total different person. That's a very real thing in a shock moment like that. You're somebody else in that place. And Tim, you know, I know you talked about being the rock, and that's something that I was trained to in my life, but like you said, being a caged animal is really a very accurate description of that. You know, you're having to drive back to this and you're having to wait that long in the car. I mean, what kind of thoughts were going through on that ride back, you know, to home to Patrick? What kind of, you know, how did you handle that, so to speak, and what kind of emotions were you feeling as you were on that journey?
Oh, um, I mean, we made it back, so we clearly handled it. But yeah, the the first bit of it was just coming to the realization for what we knew, people told us had happened. Then you get to, um, well, I didn't even really get to at that point how I felt about everything or things of that nature. So you're not thinking those, or at least I wasn't thinking those. I was thinking more what happens next, how do we get people over there, who to call. And here we are, driving down the highway. Laurel is, you know, very much um, out of it at that point. And yeah, I'm trying to call people and keep my voice going and asking people to drive over there, and no one who lives terribly close. And so, yeah, and we couldn't get a hold of either of our sons that were there. So we didn't know what they were. No one would answer the phone for us. And, that's understandable. We couldn't do anything for them from where we were, but it was very difficult.
Yeah, and I mean, for my part, it was very out of body. I mean, I was literally kicking the car for quite a while. And I mean, I look now and I think that was the trauma response in my body, just like trying to get out, like, and I'm sure being very incoherent and asking lots of, questions to Tim that he had no ability to answer. I do think though, then after a little bit of time, I mean, he was going into problem solver mode, as he said, but then I sort of was like, okay, yes, we need to make sure Dylan and Eamon are surrounded. And so I was able to reach a friend, a local friend, not necessarily, we just needed to get somebody there. And so it was, a combination of that. And then, in my mind, I think as we got closer to home, um, and this is like speaks to my own issues around grief and stuff, but like I'm basically flailing around, right? Like completely, out of control, understandably. And I come into a whole house of people, which was not my preferred, way to um just, I felt like I could feel this inner tension even then in that moment. I mean, I didn't allow it, but I remember thinking this is going to be too much for everybody here because, for the most part, I think we can agree that both of our families are a little more emotionally stoic, you know. And so I know it was too much for some people. They left kind of quietly out the back door. I mean, they were there for Tim and so forth, but it it was a lot. And I remember standing in the front hallway and just waiting for somebody to come, like, and embrace me. And I think everybody, and this was just like, you could make a movie out of it, how people are afraid, like, who are the people who are so afraid of what's happening here, and who are the people who can literally take it on. And eventually, I think it was my sister-in-law or somebody, so not even like a direct, who came in and like was the first one willing to like, embrace me. And yeah.
So Tim, talk to me about, in that moment. I know there's so much going on. Did you, I know Laurel, you kind of touched on it too, but did you guys, have that big sense of, were there people there that emotionally understood where you guys were at and comforted you or consoled you in certain ways with words, or was it more of a, everybody was in a big state of shock at that point and just didn't really know what to say or even to say something?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer to your question is probably I wasn't in a state of mind to understand what I was feeling, so I could never even begin to think of what others were feeling. Yeah, this journey for me has been, it didn't end there, but it probably started there or close to started there. And yeah, someone could have told me anything and it wouldn't have mattered. I didn't know how to react to it no matter what. So yeah, there were people there, and I've heard sense and given guidance to people afterwards. Just being there is enough. It's not a what you say, it's more of a how you say it, and just the fact that you're being there. And I believe that, and for important things at that point in time, my recommendation is say them many, many, many times because the person you're saying them to might not be able to hear it right then. So yeah, it was a little bit different of a journey for me than for Laurel because um, yeah, I kind of felt my role was okay, I have to protect her. So I had a job. My job was to protect her and to subsequently get her through her surgery and things of that nature. Um, so that gave me at least a little bit of purpose, and probably made it in some ways much, much easier for me. In other ways, maybe it just deferred things for me, but it gave me kind of a, hey, here's what I need to do. No one told me what I needed to do. This is what, learn behavior, et cetera. This is what I need to do now. And so it gave me that sense of purpose, if you will.
I think that's something really big for us men, and that's why we have a hard time with grief. Is we're taught to be the rock, be the strong one, and as you said eloquently, because my family was like that too. Emotions are for later. We got to be present right now and stoic. And I think that sometimes we go through a loss in life. It happened to me when I lost my son, and it sounds very similar when you lost Patrick. That there's a loss that happens that breaks that cycle, and it breaks it on purpose, and that opens up that gate for you to really explore grief and what it means to you and gets you to process and understand how you really feel about what you just went through. I wanted to ask you guys both a powerful question since I have you guys on the show today. Did you guys, how did you grieve through this process? Because I know that sometimes there's people that are very internal grievers, they don't really show it outwardly, and there's people that are very external grievers that like to talk about what happened and they like to share and express themselves more fully. What ways did you guys grieve through the loss of Patrick, and how did that affect your relationship?
Mm.
That's a very big question. Um, I will start with the end of your question first on how did it affect our relationship. And yeah, shortly after um, after this happened, so this was in the beginning of the summer, and then late at the end of the summer, Laurel was actually taking her older son to college in Ireland. And then she spent 6 weeks there, I think 3 weeks, 6 weeks, I don't even remember how long, by herself. And at the time, yeah, I had told friends and probably Laurel as well, I felt we were a coin flip at best, when she came back. Um, and uh, and obviously, heads. So yeah, we were still together, but that was not the end of it. And I was still, I would say, largely kind of in denial about that grief, and then went through a number of other periods of grief over the next 2 years, smaller things, but still very real grief, losing a job, being diagnosed with celiac, much smaller, but still things that kind of spoke to my identity, and losing those. And I just was retreating. And so, that pushed Laurel, understandably, very away from me. Um,
And
so
yeah, what I would say is what happened with me is Tim was an excellent caregiver. I mean, he was like the best. And so there was this period of time where it was like, oh yeah, this is why I was drawn to this person, because he is this rock. He is solid and my whole world has fallen apart. And he was the nursemaid and he was there. And then, fortunately, I had this amazing care, and, within a couple of weeks, I felt, I mean, obviously, I had no idea what was in front of me in terms of the physical aspects of grief, but in terms of the recovery from the surgery, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. So for like several years after the surgery, whenever family members or people, how's your back? And I just wanted to scream and say, it's not my back. It's like my heart. Like, how's my heart doing? And so I think, as Tim said, it was a comfortable role for him, but I had thought about going to Ireland well before any of this had happened. And so there were several reasons for that, including the fact that Patrick was going to attend a college in our town. And I just could not be here when all these kids were starting school. We live in a college town where Northwestern is. And I just, so my MO was retreat. That was also just part of my own wounding that I brought, that I've, to withdraw. But also, I didn't want to be somebody's project, or to fix anymore. And that's what it was starting to feel like. This well-intended energy coming at me from Tim was very much focused on my physicality, but the emotional, can we share our grief, can we talk about what happened, wasn't wasn't
it
there.
didn't exist at that point.
And so there was part of me that's like, I am a very strong person in my own right. Like, I can go and do this thing. Looking back, was it exactly the right choice to go for 5 weeks? Probably not. I mean, it had some upsides to it. And I did want to take my son back to school. I felt really like the mom, who wanted to be able to do that for her son. It was his last year at school. And because of COVID, I had never really been able to do that with him, or had been 3 years. So there were multiple pieces of it, but behind it was this sense of like, I need some space from you because I'm actually feeling kind of smothered. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a real hard challenge that when we go through grief, and especially as a married couple, because I've always said that when you get married to somebody, you're marrying somebody completely different from you, and their mindsets, how they process grief, maybe what they've been taught about grief, could be very different from you, and that can cause a lot of tension and some hardship when you go through a loss, especially like you and Tim did. Uh, losing Patrick, that's a big challenge in a marriage. And the reason I wanted to ask you guys those questions is because in the lost community of parents where I'm in with infants, because I lost a stillborn, I've seen a lot of couples fall into divorce, but I've also seen ones that stay together and they always find a way, which I found very powerful. So that's why I wanted to ask you guys those questions, because I
Yeah.
do know that there are grief that gets so heavy in a marriage that it really separates and divides, and it's really hard to watch happen. But I understand it when it does, because grief is a very powerful tool, and a lot of people don't see it in that aspect, but it's something that makes you really go within. It kind of breaks a lot of belief systems and constructs you've had over your life, and makes you question yourself at the deepest level about who am I and how did this impact me? How did this affect me? What does life going forward look like? Who am I going to be going forward? I know, Tim, you said that you went through a job loss and getting diagnosed with celiac. Those are big life changes to come after losing a child to suicide. That's a hard path.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, one of the things I'll say kind of in my journey here, right after we lost Patrick, Um, we attended some couples sessions, very, very good sessions. Loss is the name of the group we went to. Um, and um, I would say for those, I went for Laurel. I was there because of Laurel, not for me. And I very much felt that way. There was
Mm.
I'm there to support her through her loss, and it's not my loss. Um, Roll forward 2 years from then, and we went through a rough patch, and then kind of were getting on the back end of that rough patch, and I'm shocked that she did it, and I'm almost more shocked that I said yes. But we decided to go to a couples grief retreat, and that one, whether I intended it to be for me only, or if I intended it to still be for her, it turned out to be, from my perspective, completely for me. It was one that I was ready for it at that point in time. I was, all in for it, and got more out of it than I ever thought I ever would. Met some wonderful people, all of whom are grieving, and seeing that, the common theme, at least that I took away, was, your grief will never get smaller, but your life can get bigger. And yeah, it can get bigger. It doesn't have to get bigger. You can shrink, but it can get bigger and get beyond those things. But the grief is never going to go away. So don't try to push it somewhere that that you think it's going to shrink away to nothing. It won't, and it can't. And I at that retreat, yeah, it was, I would say, 50 people, roughly half of them couples, half of them individuals.
Actually, there were only 7 or 8 couples. So very much a minority
Okay.
were couples. And I think it speaks to what you've alluded to, Chris, which is I think the divorce rate for couples who've gone through the death of a child is like around 50%, or if not
And
higher.
and I was the only step parent of anyone there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And it was one where, one of the biggest things for me is I didn't really feel worthy of the same degree of having the same degree of grief. Yeah, even though I'd known Patrick since he was 6, and his father had passed away, and I, played a lot of that role, I still was his stepdad, not his dad. And so, a lot of it for me was just feeling like, yes, I deserved to be able to grieve. And that was kind of something that definitely kind of flipped a flag for me, and has helped me tremendously. So, and it wasn't a spot I could have been in, you know, 2 months after, 6 months after. It just wouldn't have done the same thing.
So something you brought up a few times in the last 10 minutes, which I think is very powerful, and it's why I'm glad you're on this episode today. When did you give yourself permission to grieve? Because it sounds a lot like you played the traditional man role, which I did too, by the way, for my wife, of being that rock, being that stoic figure to say, okay, I can support my wife, I can be there for her. We're gonna get through this, we can make this. What point did that shift inwards for you? And at what point did you give yourself permission to say, I deserve to grieve. I deserve to feel something in this moment. I've got emotions to
Yeah.
process.
Um, yeah, no, and it wasn't I wasn't trying to give myself permission to grieve. So that was not my intention. My intention was, how do I connect with my feelings? And that was
Mm.
around the time Laurel and I were going through a rough patch, and it was on me, and I just was not sharing the things I was feeling. And a large degree of it was I didn't really know how I was feeling. That's not something that, yeah, if Laurel had asked me, how are you feeling? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't really thought too much about it. And, that's something, for the future. And so I started a process of meditating every day, of really trying to understand, seeing a therapist, of course, things like that that I hadn't done before. And that kind of took me to a spot where, the grief started coming up as a potential and as, that, oh, yes, I should be grieving, or not should be, I am grieving. And it's just, I should be allowing myself to understand that, etc. But it was not an easy process.
No.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that because that's something that I don't hear men enough say is learning my feelings. I know a lot of men think that's soft. It is the most vulnerable strength thing you could ever do. Is to say to learn how to express your emotions. And I love that you said that you tried meditation. You went to therapy. I've done therapy too since I lost my child. It's been very helpful. And I think that something not a lot of people know when they go through a very big loss, like losing a child to suicide, losing a child to stillbirth, that's one of the most painful losses of life you'll ever go through, in my opinion. And what oftentimes happens though is that to our body to protect us will actually suppress that pain from our mind. And so, because us men weren't really taught about emotions and feelings growing up, we were taught to be stoic and throw them in the back. When we do run into a grief situation, our body suppresses it into the subconscious. And it's not only until we find that calm space in our mind or we find a safe place that somebody allows us to open up in that area or gives us tools and resources to learn how to do that, only then does it come up. And it's usually a very heavy feeling when it does. We kind of go, ooh, whoa, I did no idea I felt this way.
Yeah.
And I will say, to go back to the grief retreat, I was completely, and this, I don't even know, like, blown away would be sort of an understatement, but like within 24 hours of being there, and this is a testament to how good of a job they do, it was like this whole other side of him that I had never seen came out, which was just very forthcoming and vulnerable. And we had an amazing facilitator, they're all trained therapists, and just the tears and it was lovely. I mean, it was something I'd been waiting, I would even say predating Patrick, just because I obviously know this tender part of Tim, but it, as we've discussed, had gotten buried for a lot of reasons. And I just couldn't get over it, and so it was yeah, it was quite incredible, and it was quite a gift for him to have that permission. I think one of the words that we used in our group was this idea of belonging. We all go through life, and I think you and I talked about it, maybe Chris, in our last conversation. But grief certainly doesn't help you to feel like you belong. And then, as Tim said, he had the father role or identity that he thought made it so he didn't belong to the grief circle. And he was able to share that with the other men in the group who had their own versions of that. In particular, one of the couples, I think their grief was like 9 years out. They had lost a child very young and then decided to, come to this retreat. And so we all do that. And I'm so grateful, that we had that opportunity, because that was really, I mean, we had been reconnecting since the fall, because as Tim said, we had this sort of like, it goes around our 11th wedding anniversary, and I felt incredibly alone with my grief. And part of that was on me, because, I had my own toughness, my own tough exterior that we also talked about a little bit, and my own coping mechanisms. And I thought I had to kind of DIY it, but I was desperate, for us to be more connected. And I was trying in different ways that weren't necessarily being received.
So I got two questions about the grief conference that you guys went to, our grief retreat. My first one that I wanted to ask is, Tim, I am still trying to wrap my head around you being the only stepdad in that room. I find that incredibly fascinating. And the reason I wanted to ask you questions about this is that grief at times can feel very isolating. It can feel like you're in your own little planet of things because people around you may not be able to support you, or they may say insensitive things, or they may not even capable or able to hold space for you. What was it like being the only step parent in that grief retreat? And did you have any revelations that came to you, or were there people that left you with words of wisdom from that experience?
Um, So the first part on what was it like? Yeah, I was surprised with myself that I took the approach that yes, I needed to belong there, and in one of the early large group meetings, I even mentioned that I was Patrick's stepfather, because otherwise there's no way I was going to know if anyone else in that room, I didn't think anyone would talk about it if they were. And I figured when I said it, if anyone else there, I would have found out about it, because no one else said a word. And then in our private sessions or our smaller group sessions where we had a therapist for three couples, I'd say the biggest thing that I worked on and that he helped with was a sense of, as Laura was saying, a sense of belonging. Um, and if you can get that sense of belonging for whatever that is, you're going to feel a little bit better about it. For me, it was that I belonged in this group, and it's not a group you want to be in. Um, but it's worse if you don't think you belong in that group. Yeah, if you're there and you don't feel you should be, that's even worse. So that was kind of a real hard thing to overcome. But On-site foundation, highly, highly recommended. If anyone has a chance as a couple to do this, by all means, they really should. I would have been the last person you probably would have thought would have gone to one of these things, but before it. And so, and I, what I told the people there is, listen, I will never ever do this again. It was wonderful, but I will never again do this in my life. It was kind of a weird, the friends we met there, they'll be the only ones ever to hear those stories and such, because I couldn't handle doing that many times. So it was just amazing. Is excellent for both Laurel and I think. It helped both of us get closer on that. And it helped me understand, I think, my grief a lot more and what role that played and the different things that I was grieving.
And if I could just add one thing to it, I'm just remembering an exercise they had us do, which was really powerful, which, I mean, there were several very almost daily, we sort of had to write letters to Patrick and talk to Patrick, which, as you can imagine, brought up a lot. But one of the powerful exercise we did was, or we maybe it was woven throughout the week, but you were charged with seeing the couple like as an entity and like starting to think, and I think for both of us having sort of been a little bit isolated in our grief, it was an opportunity to recognize like in a more profound, deep way, like we are in this together. And as we told our story to these two other couples, I mean, the loss of Patrick was enough, but we've also been through quite a lot of things. As Tim mentioned, his job loss, we had moved, we, suddenly became empty nesters in the, worst possible way. He lost his father right before we got married. My mom has stage 4 cancer. I mean, we've been through a lot. Obviously, losing their dad um, was was hard, and so they were just sort of like, "Wow, we can't believe you guys are like still standing." And so it really gave, to say new life to our relationship is an understatement, but it really did. And I think somebody said to us at the end, or maybe it was probably our leader, like, this is really a redemption story that you're talking about. And, I got kind of chills when they said that because I always loved is it the Green Mile? Whatever that,
Good
that
movies.
Timothy Robinson, the
That
prison
is a good
movie,
movie.
which is about redemption and so
Shawshank Redemption.
Shawshank, thank you, not the Green Mile. Anyways, so that's something that I carry away from me with that. It's like, and to anybody listening, is just, I've been a big believer in second chances. I remember saying to him when we got married, "This is our second chance marriage." He did not like that term, but just the idea being that there's always an opportunity for something to be born again, and that includes a relationship.
Laurel, I'm glad you said what you just did because that was going to be my next question was how did this grief retreat change your marriage and how did it make it stronger for you guys? Because it sounds like that took you to some very deep places in your grief going through there. And I can't imagine writing letters to Patrick every day in that's retreat. That had to have been extremely difficult and very hard. So I bless both of you for being having the strength to do that. That takes a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and one of the other things that they do, and um, I am, my work has always been on computers and things like that, very connected and very distracted. It was a zero electronics week, which was very difficult.
No
Uh,
phones, no
yeah,
nothing, no
and for
TV,
me,
no watch.
who's a sports person, March Madness was going on, and I knew my team was going to lose while I was on
Oh,
this retreat. But it was just amazing how much that kind of helps you focus on the things that are important. And it really did give us kind of a renewed. We'd been, I'd say, on a good path for the couple months before then. And this, I think, jump started it because we really were able to, kind of see and understand each other's perspective. Um, and I don't think I'll ever kind of go back to something quite like that again, but it was so, uh, inspirational, etc. And the people, the couples we were with were truly amazing. And they had their own stories, and they're very different than ours, but still, there's so many similarities to it, and it makes you think you're not alone with those, and those help. And that's why, the trying to make our lives bigger, not smaller, because the grief will be there. And so that for us, we came out of it much stronger and trying to grow from there.
And that last piece is like hugely important because Tim and I are sort of in this interesting point in time in our lives. He mentioned that he, got downsized from a big corporate job a year after we lost Patrick. I've sort of been finding my own career path of being, became certified grief educator and a grief coach. And so we've been in this transitional place in terms of our professional path. And for a lot of people, well, I'm certain glad I don't have a 9 to 5 job, but you can pour yourself into your work. And so not only did we move from a very large home into a small condo and went through all kinds of changes both on every level, professionally, home wise, etc. So I was feeling very much, and I think Tim was to a degree as well, like, and every empty nester goes through this. What does our life look like without kids now that we don't have kids in the house? And what is our identity around that? And we were dealing with that on multiple layers. And so this grief retreat, I think, like I said, gave us the cohesiveness to say, you know what? Yes, we've been through a lot, but no matter what, we're going to be okay because we're now like more bonded and connected, and that safe container that maybe was feeling quite fragile and disrupted over the last 3 years is now intact. And so now how can it gave, I think, us the permission or became a catalyst for like, now we can see a way of moving our life forward that I think we couldn't quite, we kind of thought we wanted to move, but we didn't know where. And those kinds of questions have now become a lot clearer.
I think that's so. I'm just really impressed with you guys. You are the definition. I'm hearing resiliency, redemption story. I'm hearing that you guys have actually grown closer because of all these challenges in life. And that's something that is a true testament of why I wanted both of you guys on a podcast episode today, is to show people that we've all gone through some very hard challenges in life, but I look to people like you that have gone through experiences I haven't even had personally, but you've gone through so many hardships back to back to back, and it probably felt like at times that grief in life wasn't giving up. It was still going to keep throwing hard hammers at you. And to see you guys come out of that stronger and more connected, it's such a beautiful outcome. And I personally find that inspirational in a lot of ways because I wish that more couples would experience that when they do go through loss. I always try to say that grief isn't the end, but it's a new beginning. And it's a very uncertain beginning. It's a very Another thing you brought up today is identity. I think grief really challenges our identity of who we think we are, who we might have been in the past. And, it leads me to my next question I wanted to ask you guys is when you look at who you were before you went through these experiences and who you are today, what was the most powerful transformation that you picked up on the new person that you've become?
Well, I can say, and I do want to sort of invoke Patrick and his memory and who he was, because truly for me, in my hardest times, that's what's gotten me through it. Is he was just a truly tender-hearted, empathic kid who really didn't judge others and had a pretty open heart. And as somebody who's been a lawyer, has had this toughness and this guardedness and the sense of like, I can kind of do this alone, but then secretly inside did feel really alone. I've tried to channel that love for him and that understanding of, as we talked about, grief is not a problem to be solved, but to be shared. And so I've really kind of almost like on behalf of myself and Patrick, because I know this was also a wound he had of sort of feeling like he didn't belong. And how do I, he was grappling with the grief of his father when he passed. Um, and I realized like being alone and being lonely in life is just one of the worst things. And so, how it's transformed me is that I've learned to like show and share the sensitivity and the vulnerability that's sort of always been there, but it's been kind of hidden beneath layers of like, strength or, what other people may have taken for somebody who can kind of, go it alone. Um, and one of the things that Tim and I have done together that I think embodies that or reflects that is that we've done, two memorial walks for Patrick, which I will say to you, while they've been a lovely way of memorializing him, it takes a lot to publicly, to mourn, and to go forward with your story. And both of the walks that we've done over the last 2 years have became, I think, part of our connective tissue that kept us together, but also an opportunity in a way, I think, for us to share in the memory of who was Patrick and to use that love that we both felt for him as a way to remind us of how we can kind of get through this together.
For me, I'd say the biggest change for me, and it's been one I'd say just fairly recently realized, is I used to be someone who it'd be far more likely for me to cry at a stupid movie I've seen 5 times than to cry at other events that it might be, here's the appropriate time to do that. And I've started to realize that if I'm crying at that, you know, kind of sappy movie for really no good reason, that's probably my body telling me, hey, there's something else that's on your mind, and it's coming out sideways. So start paying attention to what that is, because it's not gonna stay there forever, and you'd be much better dealing with it now. And so, even if I am crying at those, which I still enjoy once in a while, but I'll really try to think through what else is going on or what in that was it the fact that, oh, this isn't something that Patrick won't be doing in the future. Is it, yeah, my relationship with the rest of the kids and other things like that? Are these things that are causing me sadness or grief or other types? Is it loss of job and things like that? But all of those, I'm much more conscious of those now than just, oh, I'm crying at some stupid movie. Great, it was a sad scene, no problem. Because the sad scenes aren't really what's causing me to cry. It's something else that it's triggering, and so I'm much more open to listening to that now and trying to understand what it triggered inside me.
Patrick, I appreciate both of you guys sharing your perspectives on how you've grown through grief and what you've learned, the biggest takeaway from it. Tim, I wanted to say something you talked about is that grief is never going to go away. And I really love that to hear that from your perspective, by the way, because So many men out there try to bury grief and try to just knuckle under and get over it and move on. And I've watched so many people where grief rears its ugly head. And I always say that because some people find coping mechanisms that get them into trouble and all sorts of things because they're not listening to grief, like you just talked about, listening to that feeling that's
Yeah.
coming out. I really appreciate you sharing that because that's one of my bigger messages I'm trying to invoke on my podcast and to get people to be open, mindful to as they're going through grief. Um, as we tie up the podcast, I just want to let you guys know I'm so grateful to have both of you on the episode today. This has been a truly eye-opening and very, very heartfelt episode of showing not just how one individual goes through grief, but to get both of your perspectives, both from a female and a male perspective. And the more unique dynamic that I love is that as having a stepfather that loves and cares about that child just as much as a father would, and to share your grief story that you've gone through is so inspiring and just so powerful. And I'm anxious for people to listen to this episode because there's so much to take away from it. So I just want to say a big, big thank you to both of you for sharing your grief story and losing Patrick on the podcast episode today. Thank you so much.
No. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
And I usually, Laurel knows this, Tim, but I'm going to share it with you because you're going to be up for this. At the end of my podcast, I always ask my guests one question, which is if you ran into somebody going through grief or loss, or maybe feel stuck in grief, what is one thing you would share with them that might help them move through that journey just a little bit easier?
No, that's a good question. And I listened to your podcast and I'm still not ready for the question. But the biggest thing I would say is just kind of reiterating what I've said a couple times. The grief isn't going to go away. It won't get smaller. Don't expect it to. Don't try to make it get smaller. Try to make your life bigger. And I would then try to say that many times because the person might not be able to hear it today. They might be able to hear it next week, next month, next year. And that's probably the most important thing. If a friend of yours is going through grief, don't just tell them once, tell them a lot of times. Because I wasn't ready to hear things after, the first couple months. It took a couple years before I was ready. And it can be the exact same message. It's just, when are you ready to hear it? So that's what I would say.
That is incredibly powerful advice, and that is great advice to share to people going through grief. You hit on a couple things with your bit of advice that I want listeners to pay attention to. I want you to notice first off what Tim said about hearing that message and sharing that with somebody multiple times over. One of the biggest things he just talked about is that grief doesn't have a timeline on it. Somebody might be able to hear that message in 2 months. Somebody it might take 2 years or 5 years to hear that message. And all of us are walking a grief journey, very individual. It's very personal. But to have somebody there that's giving you messages constantly, be aware of that when they're doing it. Like Tim said, if somebody's constantly sharing that message with you over and over and over again, I want you guys to listen. And you might not be ready to hear it on month 2. You might not be able to, but maybe month 6 or maybe 2 years out, you'll remember it and you'll hear it. And that's the moment, by the way, that your path to healing is going to start for you. So, Tim, thank you for sharing that advice. Laurel, I wanted to give you the same opportunity. Did you have a bit of advice you would share?
Yeah, I think it's really complimentary to what he said, which I would say to people that grief is really love with nowhere to go. And so don't be afraid of it, and so that's the compliment to Tim saying it'll never go away. I don't want my grief for my son to ever go away because it's a reflection of how much I loved him and how much, he still lives on through us.
Mhm.
And that is a total reframe because as we talked about, I was afraid of, like similar to Tim, but in a different way. I was very afraid of being overwhelmed by my feelings, and didn't know what to do with them early on and shut down and would often become numb or become very busy. I'm good at getting stuff done sometimes, maybe not the right stuff. And when I started to realize that's really what it was, that this ache I was feeling inside was this love, and I learned to move towards it and not away from it, you know, and realizing it's not fear, it's love. it was a complete reframe, and that's how I intend to live my life, is always asking that question of how I can best, use that love to move forward in our life.
That's another powerful bit of advice that you just shared because grief can feel very overwhelming and very, very heavy at times. And it can be, I always equate it to having a big insurmountable rock sitting on your shoulder. And sometimes you just can't get out from underneath it. You just can't. And that's just what it's going to be that day. And that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're weak. It doesn't mean you can't feel things. It doesn't mean any of those things. But like Laurel said, that big boulder is all about love. It's all about your love for that one that you lost, and it's giving you an opportunity to feel those things. And I know that it's very scary to feel grief so heavily. It's very scary to, live in those painful moments. It's very hard to do that, but there's so much love that can be found if you give yourself the opportunity, like Laurel said, to feel that grief and sit with it because it will become not only your greatest teacher, but it will show you love on a scale that you've never experienced. And with that love, you're able to move forward in your life in a more empathetic, compassion, and kind way. And to my bigger point I like to make is that when you're able to get to that place, you may run into somebody that goes through a loss like you did, or somebody who's going through grief in a different way. And you'll be the one that can help and serve them because of that. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, Laurel and Tim, thank you so much for being guests on today's episode of the Empowered Grief Journey. It's been a real honor to host you guys, and thank you so much for being vulnerable enough to share your emotions and share your story. I know with no doubt this is going to help a lot of people who listen to this episode.
Thanks, Chris. And if I could just say, you are truly a gift in terms of what you do and the ease with which you make your guests feel, and just the heartfelt warmth that you bring to a really difficult topic. So thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you, guys. And I want to thank all of our listeners today for joining Tim and Laurel and I on this episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Laurel and Tim's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.